Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who've experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about normalizing trauma reactions. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have returning Nicola Prichard. Nicola uses she, her pronouns and graduated from the University of Florida with her Bachelor of Science in Psychology. She is one of VSC's Advocacy interns and is currently a graduate student in the Master's of Social Work program at the University of Central Florida. After graduating, she plans on working to become a licensed clinical social worker and intends to continue working with individuals who have experienced trauma. So Nicola, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me again for the, I don't know what time.
Yeah, it's many times, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. And I'm also super excited to have Rachel Stachler on. So Rachel uses she, her pronouns and is a graduate student at the University of Central Florida pursuing her Master's of Social Work. She received her Bachelor's of Social Work from Florida State University in 2021. Through FSU, Rachel obtained experience working with underserved women living at a maternity home for homeless, pregnant women, and their children. Rachel is passionate about helping survivors process and heal from traumatic experiences so that they are able to have happy and fulfilling lives. Rachel is a victim advocate intern as well with Nicola at the VSC and provides crisis counseling to clients as well as co-facilitates VSC's virtual women's support group. So Rachel, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
I'm really excited too. As a very brief introduction, on this podcast, we have touched on different reactions survivors may have following traumatic events. Today, we will be diving much deeper into what those trauma reactions could look like, especially ones that are often overlooked or not talked about. So today we will be talking about conflicted feelings, how society may stigmatize certain responses to trauma, different coping strategies, and ways we can all be better supporters through normalizing and understanding the diverse reactions to trauma survivors may experience throughout their healing. So with that, I know that we have defined this a lot on different episodes, but I always like to throw out this question. I know it's a kind of a difficult thing to define in one go, but for those who may just be tuning in for the first time, love to throw out the question, what is trauma? What are we referring to when we say trauma?
Yeah, so I can speak on that a little bit. Trauma can refer to the actual event that occurred, or trauma can also be referring to the experience felt after experiencing an event that's extremely stressful or extremely scary. There's different ways that people experience trauma. when at the VSC, we work with a lot of people that experience acute trauma. For example, they witness a suicide, or they experience a sexual assault, or some kind of physical assault. But there's also, chronic trauma, which is when someone grows up or experiences trauma over a long period of time, such as someone over the years witnessing domestic violence in their household. That's trauma experienced over several years. Trauma can also be complex, and that kind of refers to when someone experiences two or more instances of trauma. Trauma also can be intergenerational, which I don't think that kind of trauma is talked about very often. Intergenerational trauma can occur when you essentially become traumatized by being raised by someone who was traumatized or experienced trauma. People can actually pass on trauma to the next generation, to friends, family members, etc.
Thank you so much for breaking that down. I think that I love that you were able to compartmentalize different types of trauma. And, as always, it's really difficult to define because it can be different for everyone. What is traumatic maybe for one person may not be for another. And I'm so happy that you brought up intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma. That's a really important topic to bring up. I know that can include, for example, for African American individuals, perhaps their ancestors through the trauma of slavery, that can be passed down. So trauma responses there. I know that perhaps individuals that are part of the Jewish community and their ancestors perhaps experiencing the Holocaust and things like that can be passed down. And they've done a lot of research on it. And we actually did a whole podcast on transgenerational trauma. So for anyone listening that's interested, please tune into that. That's a very important discussion. So I appreciate that, Rachel. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Nicola.
I do. I don't know if I haven't listened to the one that you did, to be very honest, but I think Rachel just made me think of like epigenetics and how trauma actually changes the way that your genes are expressed. And so even, trauma informs the way that someone raises us, but at the same time, it's also in your genes. So it'll change the way the genes are expressed, and that gets passed down. And so that's a lot of the intergenerational trauma comes through the genes, even though it's like way back generations ago. It's encoded in there and passed down, which I think is super interesting. I think also the idea of the different types of trauma is important. I know there's that idea in psychology about big T trauma and little t trauma, and I'm not a big fan because I feel like any trauma is trauma, and I don't want to minimize that. So I'm not the biggest fan of that labeling system, but anything has the potential to be traumatic. Like divorce can be traumatic, bullying is traumatic, a sexual assault is traumatic, a car accident is traumatic. And someone could get in a car accident and it's wildly traumatic for them. But for someone else, maybe they also get in a car accident and it's not that traumatic for them. It's technically traumatic, but they don't have a lot of repercussions afterwards. So it's very different, and it looks different for different people.
Absolutely. We did a podcast before with a wonderful therapist who had an example of a child, those like fold out couches that can become a bed, where a child who maybe gets folded into that, for one child that can be extremely traumatic and scary. But for another, that might be fun. So again, that's like another example of how different trauma can be for different people. And with that, I think that trauma reactions can also be very, very diverse, right? So first off, I wanted to define what exactly is a trauma reaction. What are we referring to when we talk about trauma response or trauma reaction?
So I think of trauma reactions as kind of the behavioral adaptation that your body makes in response to its requirement to adjust your worldview. So something traumatic happens, and a lot of the time people's worldview has changed and they've lost their worldview before. So your body adapts to this new way of seeing the world and your new way of seeing yourself. but sometimes over adapt. And so sometimes you can have reactions that may not benefit you as much as your body thinks it's benefiting you. So it's trying to keep you safe, and it's trying to keep you safe in this new environment, but it's not necessarily functioning or adapting to the actual environment that you're in and the level of safety that you're in.
Right. And like Nicola said, trauma responses are our body's way of adapting to a situation that is traumatizing or a situation that is really scary or really stressful and requires us to respond or be prepared for some type of action. Trauma responses, we're tending referring to those actions that linger after the environment isn't traumatic anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think, again, and we'll dive a little more into this, but obviously during like a healing, during the healing process, the body is trying again to protect us, like you were both mentioning. However, maybe the environment is not actually, there isn't that immediate danger. And so your body is expelling all of this energy to try to protect you, when really that can manifest in a way where it can be very taxing and actually counter helpful, right? But before we kind of dive more into that, I wanted to know, what are some of those common trauma reactions that you want to highlight? You know, I know that trauma can affect people in a variety of different ways: physically, emotionally, psychologically, socially, sexually. I know there's a lot here, but I wanted to kind of give you all the platform of what are some that you want to highlight and bring up today.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. When Nicola and I were actually first discussing coming on this podcast and talking about trauma responses, I caught myself discussing, what are some common trauma reactions versus what are some uncommon. And then I realized that that could really be reframed into what are some acceptable and commonly talked about trauma responses versus what kind of trauma responses are also common, but they're not commonly talked about and not commonly accepted. When you think about a trauma response, what's typically expected of a trauma survivor, um, or what's really commonly talked about are symptoms like sadness, crying, depression, social withdrawal, isolation, things of that nature. But there's also some trauma symptoms or trauma reactions that are really common in survivors as well, but they're not as commonly talked about. We were hoping to get into some things like dissociation, hypersexuality, suicidality, drug addiction, because those kinds of trauma responses are just as common as the others. There's just kind of a stigma around it.
Absolutely. I think that I love that you reframed it, because I think that just the change of language right there is super really important. And Nicola, were there any ones that you wanted to specifically dive into and uplift as well?
I think Rachel did a really good job of summarizing them. I think there's this idea of what someone should look like when they're reacting to trauma, and the idea of like the perfect victim who has, they're crying and they're devastated and their whole world's falling apart. Whereas some people aren't like that, and some people, their bodies go straight into denial and they're laughing with their friends and they're going out, and it looks very different for them. So I think it's important to talk about all of the trauma reactions and not just the classic someone who's been traumatized response that people think of. Even though maybe someone has that reaction and that's valid for them, other people's reactions may look different.
Absolutely. And just to kind of highlight some of those, the disassociation, can either of you kind of just explain what that is for people who may not know?
Yeah, so for anyone that doesn't know what disassociation looks like, I mean, it can look a lot of different ways for different people, but disassociation typically refers to, um, I guess, feeling disconnected from yourself and from your environment. People that disassociate might have a lot of memory loss, or they might feel like they're outside of their body experiencing the world, or that the things around them aren't real. and that their worldview doesn't make sense. And disassociation is a trauma response that occurs because separating yourself from your body can feel a lot safer and can protect you if you're going through something traumatic, but it becomes an unhealthy trauma response when there's no need to disassociate from your current reality because your current reality is not threatening, it's not scary, and it's not traumatic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking it down. It's kind of, it can be difficult to kind of understand if you haven't experienced it. I've heard of people explaining it as, perhaps if you've ever driven a car for a very long time and then all of a sudden you're somewhere else and you kind of were just not really in the present moment. That is kind of maybe a way to maybe start understanding what it might feel like, and how mindfulness is all about kind of bringing you back into the present moment. And that I know that that's a tool that a lot of therapists and counselors use with their survivors to kind of bring them back into the present moment, since disassociation is kind of pulling you out of this feeling of this out of body experience. Another one I feel like is memory, and that can be really confusing for people too. I don't know if there was any kind of comments you wanted to bring up in regards to how memory can be affected.
So I think with memory, it's important to think about the physical way that memories are created and how it differs when it's a traumatic memory or if it's a regular, ordinary memory. And traumatic memories are generally more sensory and a lot more fragmented because if you think about the way that they're encoded, it's using a different part of the brain to encode those memories and to process those memories because survival is like the number one task for your brain in that second. And so if your brain is trying to make these memories, but you're trying to survive, it's getting bits and pieces of oftentimes sensory ideas of what was happening. And I think they've found in studies of survivors of sexual assault or any kind of trauma's brains, when they have flashbacks or when they think back to the memory, it's primarily the part of the brain that deals with the sensory input and less linguistics. So that's also why a lot of people can't really verbalize the trauma or explain the trauma to someone, is because the part of the brain that mostly is in charge of coming up with the words for it doesn't function the same. It kind of shuts down when you think about trauma. But at the same time, that's paired with it wasn't stored as that kind of memory with a ton of words that go with it. It was stored as more of like a sensory experience, which is why you see people triggered by things that remind them sensory wise, things that smell like it, things that sound like it. But so for memory, when you're trying to remember, I feel like you're getting these bits and pieces. And so it's easy for your brain to fill stuff in that may be wrong, but that doesn't change the fact that the trauma happened to you. It was just a side detail that wasn't the exact threat that was happening at the time, because that's the most important. And I think that's also why people don't talk about that, is because whenever people bring up memory issues, it's more in the sense of they don't remember this, so they must be lying, instead of they don't remember this because it's traumatic and because that's exactly how the brain functions.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. As the educator here at VSC, I talk a lot about how this effect of trauma, especially when I'm working with first responders, because since they're working with survivors, it's so important for us to inform them that this is very common and that it doesn't have anything to do with credibility or anything like that. It's a very normal response to trauma. So just kind of taking your time with this person and understanding that memory. And I appreciate you kind of breaking down the way memory is stored, because it explains a lot as far as the sensory part of it. I know that, for example, maybe the smell of coffee was involved somehow. And so this person may be avoiding all coffee shops or something like that. That can happen as well. I know that we did a whole actually podcast about drug addiction and other things. And we're going to talk a little bit more about coping mechanisms and things like that. And you also brought up this idea of hypersexuality, which I think that can maybe surprise some people in regards to survivors of sexual violence. I think when we were talking earlier that, again, we kind of think of sadness and depression, but we also think that survivors of sexual violence, that it would make sense that they would become hyposexual, right? But then I also understand that some survivors, a common reaction is hypersexuality or increased sexuality. So I wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when we think about rape or sexual assault, it's a crime of violence. And one of the things that survivors lose in those moments, and sometimes the feelings of after, is power and control. Survivors might feel like they lose control over their bodies or control over their right to make decisions and give consent. So a lot of times hypersexuality, or like you said, being overly sexual or more sexual than before, is really an attempt to get control over their trauma and control over their sexuality back. Becoming extremely sexually active might make a survivor feel like they do get to choose when they want to have sex, or that sex is always their choice, or they might be trying to untraumatize themselves from sex.
I appreciate you bringing that up. I think in general, we as a society don't talk about sex at all. And then, of course, there's like slut shaming and all this awfulness. So I think that it's super important that we talk and normalize that too. But we also talked a little bit about in the intro that we wanted to talk about some kind of, conflicted feelings or feelings a survivor may have after sexual violence that are stigmatized. Or when we were planning this podcast, we called them in quote unquote not allowed feelings. So what are some examples of those?
So I think the ones that come to mind first are, after someone is sexually assaulted, and anger is obviously part of that, but a lot of women especially feel like they're not allowed to be angry. They have to be sad or more passive emotions than anger. Well, I don't know if passive is the word, but they're not allowed to feel angry. And especially, I feel like wanting, I don't want to say revenge, but even if you did want revenge, even though that's completely valid, that's not allowed. Or if you just want the person to be punished for what they did to you, that's not allowed. With any other crime, I feel like that's completely valid. If someone stole your car, you would be upset and no one would judge you for wanting that person in jail. But when it comes to sexual assault, people use the reason that you want them to go to jail is just because you don't like them, and so you made this up to send them to jail. So they kind of use that against you when it's just a normal reaction to someone doing something wrong and violating you. And I think that can be really hard. I think kind of along with that is not being allowed to want that person to receive a punishment, or not being allowed to be angry just for yourself. A lot of the time I feel like you have to be angry for other people, and so you have to want them to go to jail to protect other people in this hypothetical future in which they hurt others. You can't just want them to go to jail because they did something to you and you're angry about it and they deserve that, which I think is hard. And another one that kind of came to mind was to do with kind of confusion. I feel like you're not allowed to be confused. So if you are assaulted, and a lot of the time sexual assault is committed by people that know you and that you trust, and so it's often inherently confusing, and you're not allowed to think, was that sexual assault or not? No. And kind of figure that out over time. And maybe at first you don't label it as that, but over time you do, but that's like not allowed. You have to either know it or not when it first happens, and then that's it.
Yeah, it's almost like going back to the credibility thing. And just quickly want to bring up the what you mentioned, which is actually 8 out of 10 times it is someone that the survivor knows, which is a myth that it's always a stranger. And so, yeah, it makes sense that there is this kind of inherent that someone may feel confused. Why would someone that I trust and love do this to me? Rachel, did you have something you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, speaking on feelings that are considered not allowed, specifically with male survivors of sexual abuse or sexual assault. Um, Even the of feeling like you were sexually assaulted or being upset that someone had unconsensual sexual intercourse with you, or raped you, just feeling like that happened to you, is considered not allowed for a lot of male survivors. I mean, I think that's because our society expects men to be extremely sexually active and to always want sex, and to want sex with any woman, whether or not it's a partner or a stranger or someone older. I feel like men's feelings can be invalidated in that sense because it's not understood why a man wouldn't want sex. So just, I guess, the act of even feeling like you were violated is not always allowed to our male survivors.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that that's super, super important to highlight, because we know that sexual violence does not discriminate by any means by gender, race, ethnicity at all, right? And anyone can be a survivor. While you were both talking, I had this question in my head: why we think that these feelings are stigmatized, and I have some thoughts I wanted to share, but before I do that, and you were already getting to it, Rachel, but are there any other reasons why you think that these stigmas even exist at all?
I think, I mean, Rachel kind of touched on this, but gender norms a lot of the time play a role, and what, women or men are supposed to feel, which obviously leaves out a lot of genders anyway, so it's problematic in that sense. But it's, this idea that certain people are allowed to feel certain feelings, and that if you are a specific kind of person, then you're not allowed to feel this class of feelings. But if you are, then you get to feel these feelings, but you can't feel these other ones that happen. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's based on the idea of, I guess, also age could play a factor. So a lot of demographic factors. And also, if you think about race as well, Black women specifically are expected to be very strong, kind of that word of, the strong Black woman, but they're not allowed to express the more messy parts and anger and the inherent feelings, because that's what's expected of them. And so I think a lot of demographic details about someone kind of indicate how they should react to trauma, even though it's not accurate.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up that other stigma too, and intersectionality, right? When a lot of different identities are intersecting, and because of those different identities, society has different expectations on you. I would also argue that when you were talking about how survivors almost aren't allowed to feel, the want of, justice, essentially, it's almost as if we know as society does not hold individuals accountable for sexual assault. So it's almost like not allowing survivors to be angry, not allowing survivors to want justice is a way of kind of making abusers get away with it in another sense, or even just not allowing people to express themselves. It's almost like encouraging survivors to suffer in silence, if that makes sense too. So I think it's just really, when it comes down to it, it's just another form of rape culture, really. I also wanted to ask if, the survivors that you work with, because I know that you both are phenomenal and work with our survivors as amazing crisis counselors, in addition to everything else that you do at the VSC. Do the survivors you work with ever feel guilty for having these really normal reactions or responses to trauma?
Absolutely. My mind goes all over the place because we've touched on so many different trauma responses, and I've heard so many stories from so many different survivors about different examples. But what I find is a lot of survivors I work with just don't seem to understand why they're experiencing certain trauma responses as symptoms. And
it's embarrassing almost for them to talk about what's going on or talk about their normal trauma responses, because they don't understand where these things are coming from.
I think that's such a good point. Because another normal response is embarrassment and shame, because we as a society don't like talking about this. So that makes complete sense that would also be even, which is almost even more complicated, feeling embarrassed for feeling embarrassed or something like that. So absolutely. Do you have anything you want to jump in on, Nicola?
I think most commonly the two responses that I see as less likely to be endorsed by my clients is anger and suicidality. I feel like anger, a lot of the time, they feel like they have to justify it when they explain it to me. Or they'll say, I'm angry, but I'm only angry because I don't want him to do this to other people. Or imagine if this was someone else. So that's something that we work through a lot in saying it didn't have to be because it might happen to someone else. It's okay to be angry because it happened to you. That's bad enough. End of story. You don't have to have this hypothetical to be allowed to be angry. So that's something that we work on a lot. And I know Rachel, before we start this podcast, actually had a few really true and interesting thoughts on the topic of suicidality as well.
Yeah, so I would say the most avoided trauma response that clients will open up to me about would be those feelings of suicidality, or suicidal ideation, whether it's passive or active. I've never had a client openly admit to me that they are experiencing suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations. I pretty much always have to directly ask about these things. And there's a lot of reasons that I think survivors of any kind of trauma, or really anyone, would be afraid to talk about suicidality. Um, for starters, it's taboo to talk about suicide, just like our society doesn't like to talk about sex. Our society doesn't like to talk about death, especially death by suicide. Um, there's also maybe not that realization that in mental health, there is an understanding that suicidal ideation is not the same as suicidal as intent. And having suicidal ideation does not necessarily mean that someone is going to commit suicide. I just think there's a lot of fear around admitting that you have those deep, dark feelings, because they're not talked about. And there's that idea that if someone admits or opens up about suicidal thoughts or feelings, that they're going to be sent to a hospital or they're going to be picked up by law enforcement. When in reality, it actually is okay for you to talk to your mental health providers about suicidal feelings.
Yeah, and it can be life-saving, right? And is life-saving to talk about them. And I appreciate you just being honest that it is a scary thing to talk about in general. There, of course, is a stigma about it, but also it can be just scary. So I'm really glad that there are professionals out there that are just directly asking and sharing with survivors and anyone really who are having these suicidal thoughts or ideations, that there's a difference, and it's really being able to have the space to talk about it is super, super important. In addition to that kind of danger, what are the dangers of stigmatizing these really common reactions to trauma and just misunderstanding trauma reactions in general? Why is it bad that we as a society don't normalize these very normal responses?
I think the biggest danger we face by not talking about these topics and by stigmatizing them is we create loneliness for people. We make survivors of trauma, or people with mental health issues, feel alone, because if they don't know that there are other people out there experiencing the same thoughts and feelings, or even experiencing the same traumas, they feel alone. They feel like maybe they'll be judged, or, you know, maybe they'll get in trouble for having these thoughts or feelings.
Or yeah, and going off of that, while you were saying feelings of loneliness, that's why when I hear about our support groups, a lot of times it's to kind of let other people know that you're not the only one who is experiencing these things. Is very normal what you're going through. I think that some survivors too may feel like there's something wrong with them for what happened to them, which it's nothing is wrong with them. It's just very normal. So I appreciate that. Nicola, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on as far as that?
I don't think so. I feel like Rachel summarized that really well. The only thought I had was, just feeling like they're abnormal, there's something wrong with them. But yeah, I feel like that was a really good explanation.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to ask about specifically conflicting feelings. So we talked about like the not allowed feelings, but what about conflicting feelings? Have any of your clients ever had kind of this, they like to call it, the fancy term for it in psychology is cognitive dissonance, or kind of these like two feelings that seem like you can't feel them at the same time. Have your clients ever experienced those or expressed those before?
Yes, about a couple of things. I think healing in general is kind of talks about like this fun, empowering journey, and it's not fun and empowering a lot of the time. And I feel like it's a lot of work, and sometimes you can be exhausted by that work. And so there's kind of this contradiction of sometimes you burn out from trying to heal, and you need lighter things, which are still considered healing, going out and resuming your previous routines and seeing people, things that maybe you were avoiding because you were trying to heal, not getting enough of, focusing on that instead of the very deep healing work for a bit is absolutely allowed and absolutely okay. But I think some people feel guilty if they're not always actively healing. And even with that, I mean, some people feel grateful during their healing journey. And I think that sometimes it can feel to them like they're grateful for the trauma because they're happy with the person that they're becoming and the work that they've done. And I think that sometimes it's redirecting that to you're grateful for the person you are and you're grateful for the strengths you have that have gotten you through this process. And so you don't have to feel guilty because you're finding your own strengths and you're grateful for yourself. You're not grateful for the trauma that happened to you. You're just grateful that you got yourself through it.
I love that you brought that up because I know that a lot of survivors may find meaning through comfort through finding meaning through trauma, which can be confusing or feel contradictory as well. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that you brought up that it is, healing is such a great word, right? And it's got a lot of positive attributions with it. I personally think of like light or kind of like this path maybe that someone is taking that has like a sunset or something. And I appreciate you kind of highlighting the real realities of it, that it is a lot of work. And anyone who is going through that right now, who may be listening, just wanted to acknowledge and uplift that, thank you for doing that work. And you really are doing that work. So I love that you brought that up. Are there any other kind of conflicting feelings that you want to highlight?
Yeah, really commonly in work with someone who's experienced interpersonal violence or domestic violence, you see those conflicting feelings of love and anger. And I think that's really confusing for a lot of people that have experienced trauma, and specifically in this example, at the hands of their partner or a parent, or even a sibling. You can still love someone and simultaneously be really, really angry at them and really hurt by something that they've done to you. And I think someone who's experienced that kind of violence might feel shame about even admitting that they still care about this person that's hurt them.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think that it's super important that when we talk about cognitive dissonance or conflicting feelings, that it is possible to feel a lot of things at once, and it's complicated, and that's okay. And survivors are already feeling so much shame that's put on them by society. It just breaks my heart to feel as if that has to be another feeling that they're feeling, as far as shame for their own feelings, which should just be completely validated. I have heard, I forget who it was, but someone mentioned like some mental health professional on like social media or something. They just talk, before we would talk about like validating feelings or valid feelings, and it's almost just like it's just a feeling. It's not, there aren't right feelings or wrong feelings. They're just feelings, and being able to express them is everyone's like right as a human being. And sometimes those feelings can be contradictory, and at the same time you're allowed to feel everything at once, because people are just complicated. So I think that I appreciate you kind of highlighting different ways that you've helped your clients kind of cope with these conflicting feelings. But speaking of coping, how would you actually define what coping is?
This question kind of reminds me of, there's a TED Talk by Guy Winch, that I love. The TED Talk is actually about emotional first aid, which is a really cool concept. So everybody should go listen to that. But something that he talks about in that I have kind of adapted for my own personal definition of coping is the process of making unpleasant feelings manageable. So whatever that looks like for you, unpleasant feelings are by definition not pleasant, and they are not great to go through and feel, but they are manageable with the right coping skills. And without them, it can feel unmanageable, and then that's when you're kind of overwhelmed, and that's the benefit of having those coping skills, but you're just trying to make things feel a bit less big and overwhelming.
I love that. Like these different tools that individuals have to process things, and not exactly masking over, right, emotions, or you're not allowed to feel them, but being able to process them in a way to make them more manageable, like you were mentioning. I know that when we talk about coping, we highlight a lot that there's healthy coping strategies and unhealthy coping mechanisms. How can you tell the difference, and what is the difference?
Yeah, so with any coping strategy, you have to not only look about how that coping skill or strategy makes you feel in the present moment, you have to kind of look at the long-term effects of the coping strategy to determine if it's healthy or unhealthy. I know we brought up drug use earlier in the podcast as a common reaction, but also as a coping mechanism. Drugs might provide a escape from the unpleasant present feelings, but long term, I mean, that can turn into addiction. It can turn into relationship problems. It can turn into negative health outcomes. So when looking at coping and deciding if something is a good or a bad coping skill, you have to look at how using this skill is going to affect you in the long term.
I love that. I think that, and at the same time, no shame, right, around this very normal response to trauma too. I remember when we did the podcast with the author of Hush No More, Dr. Vanessa Guyton. She talked a lot about how it's almost overwhelming how many, the percentage of individuals. So for example, I'm reading it right now, 70% of adolescents receiving treatment for substance abuse were surveyed, had a history of trauma. So it's a very strong correlation, and there's a lot of shame around it. It's almost like, saying the words addict and all this stuff. And so being able to also, acknowledge like this very normal response to trauma, and it can also lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms. And does it serve you or not at the end of the day? So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think even hearing that statistic, it makes sense because one of the common differences, unfortunately, between a healthy and an unhealthy coping mechanism is those unhealthy coping mechanisms tend to be more instantly gratifying. They tend to feel really good immediately when you do one of them, versus healthy coping mechanisms, such as practicing meditation, yoga, reaching out. Those things are more healthy overall in the long run, but they're not necessarily always as immediately gratifying as some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Which kind of brings us back to like the work aspect of it, right? So yeah, I really appreciate you highlighting that too. Nicola, was there something you wanted to jump in on?
Yes, this is a weird connection to make, but I feel like it reminds me a little bit of dieting in some senses. I know there's a very common thing in diet culture where it's like unhealthy food, there's like good and bad food. And some foods are less nutritious, and some coping mechanisms are like if you think about drug use, there's not a whole ton of drug use that's going to be good for you. And so I'm not advocating, obviously, that people engage in these unhealthy coping mechanisms. But at the same time, I think there's an important point of moderation and context that can be used with these coping mechanisms. Because if you think about drinking, obviously some forms of drinking are very harmful and it's not going to serve you in the long run. But if something traumatic happens to me and Rachel comes to my house and we have a few glasses of wine together and she's helping me process that, that can be a healthy coping mechanism. So you can incorporate certain things into your healing that maybe would be labeled as unhealthy, but I think at the same time, sometimes it's what you need in that second. And if that's going to get you through, I'm not saying in the long run, at times it's not, you shouldn't be ashamed about having to use some unhealthy coping mechanisms. I think where it becomes a problem is when that's your primary coping mechanism or it's negatively affecting your life in a very significant way, then it becomes worse. And obviously this doesn't apply to some things that are like genuinely just very bad for you. So I'm not saying those, but I think that moderation is important and sometimes combining them. So if you think about drinking, maybe that's an unhealthy coping mechanism, but support from a friend is very healthy. So you can combine them to make it more like have less risk in a way. So I think that maybe a combination can also sometimes be good.
I think you also bring up a really good point that too much of anything can be a bad thing, and it's not always good for someone to have one coping skill that is their go-to. So for example, like you said, if we were hanging out at our house, hanging out and talking to one friend was my only coping mechanism, that could turn unhealthy in the long run, because what if that person isn't around? Or what if there's a certain activity that you rely on as a coping skill and that activity is canceled one Saturday? So it's also really important to have a good mix of coping skills and coping strategies.
I love this. I think that there was a lot that was said there. Essentially, first off, this is what we mean by like a healing journey, right? So maybe in the present moment, this is helpful. And then later on, we can work together as far as finding what are your goals, right? Are these coping mechanisms working with your goals or making you not reach those certain goals? So for example, with utilizing drugs or alcohol to make someone feel better, maybe now this person is missing certain classes for school, and their goal is to get a master's degree, so they become a counselor, something like that, right? So there's that aspect of it too. And I also really appreciate you highlighting the fact, Rachel, that things that society can see as healthy coping mechanisms, if they are not in a balanced way, they can become unhealthy, right? So maybe venting is helpful. Overly venting can be cyclical and feelings of feeling stuck, right? Relying on one coping mechanism that may at the end of the day be canceled, and then you don't have it's like you need to diversify your coping strategies, because I think that at the end of the day, I've done so many of these, and I feel like the concept of balance has always come back into it. It really is really helpful to bring up. it also sounds like coping is super individualized. And it really depends on individuals of what works for them and what doesn't. So how do you help survivors find strategies that work specifically for them?
So I think talking to them is the most important thing, and learning about them and what do they like. And anytime I approach my clients and we're kind of figuring out what's going to work for you, it's what do you like? So if my client likes to write, and that's something that she either was passionate about before the traumatic events or she still is passionate about it, we can find a way to incorporate that into her coping style. Or if this person, maybe he likes exercising, or maybe they like baking, maybe that's what we use. And it can look like anything. Anything can be coping if it's utilized in the right way. And so I feel like kind of getting to know the person as an individual and knowing yourself. And I think that sometimes values assessments can help with that. Coming up with, what's important to you and where do you want to be in your life, and, kind of focusing on that and then looking at what is going to help me get there. And sometimes that can be, this kind of goes back to what is coping, but something that seems unpleasant, like maybe doing your taxes or cleaning out your closet, maybe that seems very unpleasant, but that will get you to where you want to be in the future. So it's kind of setting yourself up. So that can also be incorporated in. But I think just figuring out what works for you is the way that you figure out what your coping skills are.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that there are some coping strategies where you're leaning into the trauma and processing it more, and sometimes taking your mind off of it and kind of becoming, closer with yourself almost, and deciding, what do I need in this moment? And how can I get those needs met in a way that can long-term benefit me, right? And I'm so glad you brought up values assessment too. So shifting gears here a little bit, just kind of circling back to the beginning of the podcast, essentially, how can we as a society normalize these really common, really normal reactions to trauma? And why is it so important that we do that?
Yeah, so I think, any topic is normalized by increasing the amount of conversation that's had around that topic. So I think it's important that people become educated about trauma responses, and then have those conversations. I know there was a podcast done previously about being a friend or being a supporter of someone who's a survivor. You can normalize the way that people around you and yourself are coping by just understanding that coping and responding to trauma look a lot of different ways. And it's not always going to be the same when these are different people and different events and different life circumstances and different upbringings and levels of resilience. I guess talking about the fact that everyone is different and everyone's experiences are different is really important in normalizing.
Yeah, and allowing people to express or, be those individuals. I really appreciate that. I think that that's such a great way for us to do that. Just kind of like learning more. When I do my trainings, I always bring that up as far as like, there's like a section in my trainings of how to be a good supporter. And one of them is always learning more about trauma. And I think that is such a great way, so that when someone does, react to trauma in a way that maybe surprises us, perhaps someone is completely emotionally numb, that doesn't mean that the trauma didn't affect them. That's just how it is affecting them. And it doesn't mean that the trauma didn't happen. It absolutely did. And this is just their reaction to it. So I think that that's why it's so integral to be a supporter, and as a society in general, is just understanding that. So I'm so glad that we're having this discussion. Just some final questions here. What would you say to a survivor who feels like they are not reacting to the trauma correctly?
I think the biggest thing is that there's no correct way to respond to trauma. There's no outlined way of, the best way to respond to trauma, because it's not a thing. And I think the whole point of something being trauma, and by definition, it's something that's not supposed to happen to you. And it's something that is overwhelming for your coping systems and your coping ability. And so it's inherently disruptive and it sends you into a state of dysfunction. And so anyone who's living, with their body feeling like you have to survive or feeling like you're back in that, you're not making decisions based on, sound functioning. You're basically making decisions to keep yourself safe. And whatever you do in that moment, that's what your body and your brain thought was the best course of action to keep you safe. And there's no incorrect or correct way to do that. It's very individualized, and you are the only person who can say what's right for you.
I absolutely love that. And I think that that's a wonderful place to sign off. But before I do, is there anything that you would like to mention that we might not have discussed?
Yes. On April 16th, 2022, Nicola and I will be co-facilitating the Art of Healing, which will be a art workshop taking place at the VSC Gardens from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We will be utilizing journaling, an art activity, and a writing activity, as well as gratitude practice to help survivors of sexual and domestic violence work on post-traumatic growth and healing. And for anyone that's interested in attending the Art of Healing, I would encourage them to call the VSC main office line at 407-254-9415.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because we have had that in the past. And I'm glad that we're able to do that again. I know that we got a lot of great participation and survivors really enjoyed it. Nicola, was there something that you wanted to say before we signed off?
Yes, I just wanted to remind anyone listening that we do have a 24/7 helpline. And so if you ever feel that you're in crisis and you need to speak to someone urgently, you can feel free to give that line a call. And the number is 407-500-HEAL. Just for anyone, and that's 4325, just in case you don't know the numbers. But I just wanted to remind people that we do also have that service.
Absolutely. Always important to highlight. I really appreciate you both so much. And I know there's people tuning in that are not in the Central Florida area and are not able to participate in the Art of Healing group, but hopefully we can have a whole podcast about it so you can kind of at least know what it was like. But I wanted to also let everyone know before we sign off that we are recording this at the end of March, and next month is actually April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And we're actually kicking it off with an episode all about Start by Believing and the Start by Believing campaign. So next week, please tune in to that if you're interested in learning more. But I wanted to thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims and survivors of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, including the Art of Healing group and other support groups, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Rachel and Nicola, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us on today.
Thank you.